On a February morning in 1944, a Norwegian ferry crossed Lake Tindja carrying 600 kilograms of heavy water. The last industrial-grade shipment the Nazi nuclear program would ever receive. At 10:45, at the deepest point of the lake, a single 6-pound charge struck the bow plating from inside. The keel collapsed. The ferry went under in 5 minutes. The cargo fell 450 meters into glacial water no salvage diver could ever reach. A Norwegian chemist named Knut Haukelid watched from a ridge above the lake. He had calculated that the operation would set the Nazi atom bomb program back by 18 to 24 months. The Alsos investigation confirmed it. Hitler never built a bomb. This is File 23, the ferry on the lake. The Vemork hydroelectric plant in Telemark, Norway was, in 1942, the world's only industrial-scale producer of heavy water. Deuterium oxide, the chemical compound essential to nuclear reactor moderation. In the experimental nuclear research designs of the early atomic weapons era, the plant was built into the side of a steep mountain gorge above the Mon River. The Mon River's hydroelectric power drove cascading electrolysis cells that progressively concentrated heavy water from natural abundance levels of approximately 15 thousandths of 1%, up to industrial-grade levels above 99%. Vemork's industrial output of heavy water was the only such supply on Earth in the relevant strategic time frame. Norway had been under German military occupation since April 1940. By late 1941, the German Reich Research Council had taken operational control of Vemork's heavy water production line. The plant's output was redirected from civilian research customers to the Reichsforschungsrat, and specifically to the experimental nuclear reactor program led by Werner Heisenberg and Walter Botha in central Berlin. Without sufficient heavy water, the German nuclear research program could not achieve self-sustained nuclear fission. In their experimental reactor designs, the strategic question facing the program was whether they could secure enough heavy water from Vemork before the war ended. Inside the British Special Operations Executive in central London, the response began in early 1942. SOE began recruiting a small team of Norwegian saboteurs, all of them chemistry or engineering professionals, all of them having escaped Norway after the German invasion. The proposed approach was sabotage by infiltration. The plant could not be effectively bombed from the air, because its critical heavy water concentration cells were buried inside reinforced concrete walls in the basement of a building set into a mountain gorge. The plant could not be effectively assaulted by conventional ground forces, because the gorge access road was guarded by a German company-strength garrison. The plant could only be reached by a small team that could ski over the Telemark mountain plateau in winter, descend the gorge wall on ropes, breach the perimeter fence quietly, and place explosives directly against the heavy water concentration cells in the plant basement. That team was assembled across 1942. Knut Haukelid, a former chemistry student in his early 30s who had escaped Norway through Sweden, was among the first recruited. Operation Gunnerside took place in the early hours of February 28, 1943. 6 Norwegian SOE commandos, all of them having spent the previous 6 months training in remote Scottish wilderness, on a full-scale wooden mock-up of the Vemork plant basement, were dropped by parachute from RAF aircraft onto the Hardangervidda mountain plateau 2 weeks earlier. They skied approximately 100 kilometers across the plateau in winter conditions to reach the descent point above the Vemork gorge. At the descent point, the team prepared their ropes, observed the German security patrol pattern on the plant's exterior catwalk, and identified a 15-minute window between guards passing the descent route. They descended the 200-meter gorge wall in that window. They reached the plant basement entrance window. The team's officer in charge, Joachim Runneberg, a 23-year-old, who had memorized the plant's interior layout from photographs taken by Norwegian agents on the Vemork engineering staff, pried the window open and entered first. Inside the basement, the 6 commandos placed plastic explosive charges along the base of the 18 cylindrical heavy water concentration cells. Each charge was shaped to direct its blast pressure into the cell's electrolyte chamber. The charges were wired in parallel to a single timer detonator. The team had approximately 7 minutes between German guard rotations to place charges, set timers, and exit. They completed the placement in 6 minutes and 40 seconds. The team withdrew through the basement window in reverse order. They climbed halfway up the gorge ascent before the timer reached 0. A muffled explosion echoed from the plant basement. The commandos did not pause. By the time the German garrison realized what had happened, the 18 heavy water concentration cells had been catastrophically ruptured. Approximately 500 kilograms of heavy water electrolyte was flooding the basement floor, and the Vemork heavy water production line had been put out of action for an estimated 4 to 6 months. 5 of the 6 commandos escaped west across the Hardangervidda Plateau and reached neutral Sweden by mid-March. 1 commando, Knut Haukelid, remained in Norway for further operational tasks. Operation GUNNERSIDE had achieved its full strategic objective. The Vemork plant was offline. The Nazi nuclear research program's heavy water supply had been cut. The Vemork plant came back online in the autumn of 1943. German engineers had repaired the heavy water concentration cells and restored production. The plant was slowly accumulating heavy water again. By early 1944, the Reich Research Council faced a strategic choice. The plant in occupied Norway had proven physically vulnerable to Norwegian SOE sabotage. The accumulated D2O inventory at Vemork was, in their judgment, more secure if transported to Germany and stored under direct Reich control. The evacuation route was multi-stage. The heavy water drums would be moved by truck from the Vemork plant down to the railway terminus at Mel. From Mel, they would cross Lake Tindja on the regular Norwegian railway ferry, the SF Hydro. From Tinnoset, they would travel south by rail through Norway, by ferry across the Skagerrak to Denmark, and by rail through Denmark to Germany. Each leg had different security challenges. The Lake Ferry leg was the most operationally vulnerable. Knut Haukelid, who had remained in Norway since the GUNNERSIDE raid and operated under Norwegian resistance cover for the previous 12 months, received the SOE communication in early February 1944. The Germans were evacuating the remaining heavy water stocks. The crossing of Lake Tindja was the operationally vulnerable leg. SOE wanted the cargo sunk before it reached Berlin. The decision matrix Haukelid faced was direct. Sinking the hydro ferry would guarantee that the heavy water reached the bottom of Lake Tindja. In 450 meters of glacial water, unrecoverable by 1944 German salvage capability. Sinking the ferry would also kill 20 to 30 Norwegian civilians using the regular passenger service. Allowing the cargo to proceed would deliver several hundred kilograms of D2O to the Heisenberg-Botha reactor research, advancing the Nazi nuclear program by months. He prepared a 6-pound plastic explosive charge wired to a salvaged alarm clock timer. He boarded the SF Hydro at the Mel dock under cover of dark on the evening of February 19th. Posing as a dock worker, he placed the charge in the bilge space under the cargo deck. He set the alarm clock timer for 10:45 the next morning. At the deepest point of the lake crossing, he exited the ferry the way he came in. He returned to the Norwegian resistance safe house before dawn. He had 12 hours before the timer reached 0. The detonation occurred at 10:45 on the morning of February 20th, 1944. The bow plating of the SF Hydro burst outward from the underwater explosive. The keel ruptured, water flooded the forward holds. The ferry began listing to starboard immediately and went down by the bow. The next 3 minutes of the sinking were chaotic. Norwegian crew launched lifeboats and life rafts. Norwegian civilian passengers were pulled from the cold water by the crews of approaching Norwegian shore boats. German guards went into the water with the heavy water drums. The ferry continued to roll, the cargo deck submerged. The drums slid off the cargo deck and into the deep water. The ferry went under completely. 18 people died in the sinking. 14 of them were Norwegian civilian passengers and crew. 4 were the German guards escorting the cargo. 29 other people on the ferry survived, pulled from the freezing water by Norwegian shore boats. It was the deadliest single act of the entire Norwegian heavy water sabotage campaign. The cargo of approximately 600 kilograms of heavy water sank to the bottom of Lake Tindja, in approximately 450 meters of glacial water. German salvage divers attempted recovery in the weeks that followed. The depth of the water and the limitations of 1944 salvage technology made recovery impossible. The drums remain at the bottom of Lake Tindja to this day. Inside the Reichsforschungsrat in central Berlin, the impact was strategic. The shipment was gone. The Vemork plant, repaired after the GUNNERSIDE raid but operating slowly, could not produce replacement stocks before the war ended. The Heisenberg-Bode nuclear reactor program no longer had access to industrial-grade heavy water. The program was reduced to laboratory-scale experiments using only the small stocks the research teams had on hand. Before the Vemork evacuation, the program never achieved self-sustained nuclear fission before the war ended in May 1945. The post-war Allied Scientific Intelligence Investigation, the ALSOS mission, led jointly by the United States and Great Britain, reconstructed the German nuclear research program in detail using captured Reichsforschungsrat documents. The ALSOS mission concluded that the German program had been principally constrained by external factors, and that the Vemork heavy water sabotage operations, both GUNNERSIDE in 1943 and the Hydro sinking in 1944, had been the principal external constraints. The ALSOS mission's specific reconstruction of the Heisenberg-Bode reactor program's heavy water inventory across the relevant operational period demonstrated that the program had never accumulated more than approximately 1 ton of heavy water at any time. The threshold accumulation required for an operational sustained fission experimental reactor under the Heisenberg-Bode design was approximately 5 tons. The Vemork plant's pre-sabotage production rate of approximately 140 kilograms per month would have allowed the program to reach the operational threshold by approximately mid-1946. The GUNNERSIDE raid's destruction of the 18 concentration cells set the program back by approximately 6 months. The Hydro sinking destroyed approximately the equivalent of an additional 12 months of production. The combined impact pushed the operational threshold timeline past the war's end. The Nazi atom bomb was never built. Knut Haukelid received the United States Distinguished Service Cross, the British Distinguished Service Order, and the Norwegian War Cross. He returned to civilian chemistry work in post-war Norway. He lived a long, ordinary life. He died in 1994, recognized as one of the most consequential resistance fighters of the Second World War. Operation Heavy Water demonstrated a theorem of strategic target sabotage that has only become more dangerous in the 8 decades since. A complex industrial program, a nuclear research program, a biological research program, an advanced weapons development program depends on critical path inputs that have finite supply chains. Each supply chain has nodes that can be interrupted. Interrupting the right node at the right time sets the entire program back by months or by years. The interruption does not need to destroy the program. It needs only to delay the program past whatever external deadline matters. The end of a war, the conclusion of a treaty negotiation, the inauguration of a new political regime. Vemork was the critical path node of the Nazi nuclear research program. The Hardanger ski raid and the lake ferry sinking together cost less than 50 Allied lives and removed approximately 30 Norwegian civilians from the regular ferry route. The Nazi nuclear research program was, in the Alsos mission's post-war reconstruction, set back by an estimated 18 to 24 months. The war ended in May 1945 before the program could close that gap. The Nazi atom bomb was never built. The modern descendants of the Vemork doctrine include the 2020 Israeli destruction of an Iranian centrifuge fabrication facility at Natanz, the 2007 Israeli destruction of a Syrian plutonium reactor at Al-Kibar, and the 2024 series of unexplained explosions at Russian critical infrastructure facilities, supplying the Russian war effort against Ukraine. Each operation followed the same operational logic halted followed in 1944. Identify the choke point. Calculate the strategic delay. Authorize the interruption. The moral framework that halted carried into the Lake Tindja operation has, in retrospect, become one of the most studied case examples of strategic target sabotage ethics in 20th century military history. Halted himself wrote about the decision in his 1954 memoir, Skis Against the Atom. He described the calculation as simple. He described his accountability for the deaths of the 14 Norwegians on the ferry as absolute. He described his certainty that the operation was strategically necessary as similarly absolute. He carried both certainties for the remaining 50 years of his life, without publicly attempting to soften either one. The framework Halted established has been studied by every modern strategic target sabotage operator in every Western and adversary intelligence service since the war. The framework's core principle that the strategic operator carries personal moral accountability for the operational consequences of his decision regardless of the chain of authorization above him has been adopted as the operational ethics foundation of modern special operations doctrine across multiple services. The session is logged, the connection is closed, the files remain open. Every modern adversary weapons program in every country on this planet runs on critical path inputs flowing through supply chains that have identifiable nodes, specific isotopes from specific enrichment facilities, specific biological research strains from specific repository institutions, specific advanced semiconductors from specific fabrication plants, specific manufacturing process documentation that lives in specific corporate vaults. Each of those nodes is, in principle, an interruption point, which leaves us with the closing question of File 23. Which critical path node in your country's adversary's weapons development program right now do you trust the least to not be the next Vemork? Silently waiting for a small team of patient operators to determine that the cost of letting it continue is greater than the cost of interrupting it.